I spent a lot of time deliberating whether or not I should make this video in the first place. Orvar the All form has been out for 2 years, and I'm sure a lot of you have already seen the deck text. So why make a video now? Well, there have been some new cards that have come out that make building the deck a little bit more tantalizing, and I think need to be highlighted in an updated video. And I also think that a lot of the videos I watched when I initially made my Orvar deck really sort of missed the mark. Not to say they were bad, I just think that we can do better. Additionally, I want to do something different in this video as opposed to others by going more in depth with combos and interactions, because Orvar gets really confusing really fast, especially if you're a new player playing him in paper. And the heart of the deck is going infinite as often as possible. And in the words of my friend Kyle, he said, "Wait, your commander does what?" And I think that pretty much sums up the heart of Orvar and also the spirit of this commander. Just a few tips before we get started. If you don't already have Infinitokens, like these, the dry erase ones, please get them for the deck. You're going to be making copies of so many different things. You're going to run out of cards. And I think that this just makes a much better experience for you and your table that you're going to be playing with. Also, I would highly encourage you to stick around for the whole video. The deck is straightforward, but the actual interactions, the things that you may have been doing wrong anyway are the really complicated things. And we need to take time to break them down and see exactly how these work. First, let's start off with the engine of the deck, the commander. So Orvar reads, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, if it targets one or more other permanents you control, create a token that's a copy of one of those permanents. So this means in practice, if we, for instance, had a multi-targeting spell on our own permanents, we could only make a single copy of one of them. That means at the core, we really want to be running a lot of low to the ground, low CMC spells that target our permanents. And an important piece of text here is the word other. You cannot make Orvar a copy of himself with this ability, which is something I've seen other players mess up in the past. The last piece of text is regarding discard, which is only applicable to Orvar and only applicable to Orvar being in your hand. It doesn't involve you discarding other cards. It doesn't mean when you discard cards, Orvar has to be in your hand and the card itself, Orvar, has to be the one being discarded. Just keep that in mind. Now, I'm going to make this quick because both you and I know what a targeting spell is, but I'm going to focus in on the importance of which targeting spells we should be putting into this deck. Our primary focus should be recurable pieces with buyback or low to the ground spells that replace themselves. So some examples of the cheap ones are Twisted Image, Shimmering Mirage, Shadow Rift, Leap, Fleeting Distraction, and Cerulean Wisps. So you'll notice that all the cards that I just listed are at instant speed, which I find particularly important because often it allows me to respond on the stack when other players think they have me, but they don't. But now we can turn to the big enablers in our deck, which are the buyback spells, and these are Clock Spinning, Mind Games, and Whim of Volrath. The way that these work is on cast, you choose to pay an additional cost in addition to its CMC, and then as the spell finishes resolving, the spell is put back into its owner's hand rather than going into the graveyard. Now, a few key components here. First, buyback does not in fact add to a converted mana cost of a spell, even on the stack. So what this means in practice is that Whim of Volrath, for instance, is 1 CMC everywhere. Additionally, in casting a spell, there are a few checkpoints that we go through in order to determine the final cost. So cost reductions such as Sapphire Medallion actually work on buyback. This is important because if we make multiple copies of Sapphire Medallion, we get that cost reduction. And I found that games with Orvar making multiple copies of Sapphire Medallion often end in the most broken game states. Basically, we just win extremely easy. Pay attention to this next rules interaction because I've got a lot of heat for this at tables I've played at. Let's use the most confusing, but also the most powerful of our buyback spells, Whim of Volrath. So Whim of Volrath states, change the text of target permanent by replacing all instances of one color word with another, or one basic land type with another until end of turn. So on initial read, the assumption here is if a permanent does not have a color word or doesn't have a basic land type, you can't target it. Is that right? Absolutely incorrect. Not only can you target it, but you can also pay the buyback cost and then just target it again. There was an official ruling for Whim of Volrath in 2004, which states it, quote unquote, can target a card with no appropriate words on it, or even one with no words at all. If your friends don't believe you, show them this video. With Whim of Volrath in mind, that also means that clock spinning works in a similar mana. Just because there's no counter on our targeted permanent doesn't mean anything. You can still target with it. All it means is you fail to remove a counter. That's it. You still get to copy the permanent with all Orvar. And finally, for mind games, if you wanted to make a ton of copies of something, simply target your tapped artifact, creature, land, etc., because your copy is going to enter untapped. So you get around having to get to the untapped phase in your turn, and you can still reap the rewards of copying these things multiple times, such as our mana rocks. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get to our final targeting spell, which is Protection. If it isn't immediately obvious, Orvar is going to draw a lot of unwanted attention. You only have to go infinite one time for the people in your board to understand that Orvar cannot live. So all of your subsequent games, you have to be prepared, which is why our last class of targeting spell is Protection. So this includes cards like Dive Down, Essence Flux, Ghostly Flicker, March of Swirling Mists, and Teferi's Time Twist. Now, I think it's a good as time of ever to talk about timing. So when you cast your targeting spell with Orvar on the battlefield, it's added to the stack. Then Orvar will add the triggered ability to the stack to copy that permanent. This means that you're going to get Orvar's triggered ability first, and then any subsequent ETBs of that creature or whatever it is that you're copying. So this means if we cast, let's say, Dive Down on a, let's say, Venser Shaper Savant, you will copy the Venser first with Orvar, resulting in your ability to return, let's say, your opponent's Cyclonic Rift to hand. So it quickly thwarts board wipes, spot removal, counter spells, you name it. And in a pinch, sure, go ahead and just use these cards directly on Orvar. Although he's not going to make a copy of himself, the fact that we have some cheap ways to protect Orvar is really what matters here. And also later in the game, make our opponents mad with Venser, I guess. On the basis of protection, I've also included Lightning Greaves and a few of our counter spells. Now, this is one of the few decks where I think that running some free counter spells is almost absolutely necessary. So in my deck list, I'm already running a Misdirection, a Force of Negation, and a soon-to-be Fierce Guardianship. But I also run low-to-the-ground counters, such as an Offer You Can't Refuse and Arcane Denial. Now, Arcane Denial is actually very interesting. It almost seems out of place. Why run that when you can simply run a counter spell in mono blue? Well, the answer is not that intuitive. I run it because we have so many cheap targeting spells that the opportunity to counter our own targeting spell is frequent enough to warrant it. Does that sound ridiculous? Well, if it does, you may have not been paying attention. Remember that Orvar triggers on cast of the targeting spell, not upon its resolution. You see where I'm going with this. So we'll be able to make a copy of our permanent still with Orvar's triggered ability, counter our own spell, and then draw 3 cards at the next upkeep. It's just insane. Not to mention that you're going to look like an evil genius at the table for doing this. This is a longer video, and if you're getting something out of this, all I want you to do is subscribe. This video took a lot of work, research, and many hours of physically play testing to put together, and we're just getting to the really good stuff. So let's talk about my favorite part of Orvar, which is the combos. That's the heart and soul. It's why we run Orvar in the first place. Whether we're being more casual or competitive, Orvar seeks to combo whenever possible. So here it goes. Orvar is surprisingly good at ramping despite the fact that he's in mono blue, and that's because we're going to be making plenty of copies of our own lands. And so an oldie but a goodie is copying Cloudpost. Although the copies enter tapped, often we're able to set ourselves up for a very explosive next turn that for the most purposes is inevitable. It's not unreasonable to make 5 to 10 copies of Cloudpost, meaning on your turn, each one taps for 5 to 10 mana each. But maybe, just like Sonic the Hedgehog, you got to go fast. So enter my new favorite, Urza's Workshop. Although we do need to hit a 3 artifact requirement for this, it's simply a better Cloudpost if you're able to do so. And in my opinion, it's very easy to get the 3 artifacts on the battlefield with this deck. So this means with the right setup, you're going to be more reliably making infinite mana and or hitting your combos more reliably. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a personal include of mine, which is Cryptic Caves. Early on, we can make copies of it, and then later, when they're no longer necessary, we can sacrifice them to draw cards. And to be honest, it's saved me more than once. And lastly, in regard to lands, is Mystic Sanctuary, which admittedly is not a combo, but is an overperformer and also a consistency piece in the deck. Oftentimes, we may use this just to get back a simple sort of cantrip spell, Or we might be using it to get back something more important like one of our buyback spells. And this comes from the yard reliably. Not to mention, we can still copy it with Orvar to get even more of our spells back. Now let's talk artifacts. Now I'm going to highlight 2 in particular, but just note that if we reduce the cost of Whim of Volrath by 2 or the cost of Clock Spinning by 3, we can immediately make infinite copies of, let's say, Arcane Signet or our Commander Sphere. But let's get started with a new and exciting card, which is Throne of Eldraine. Now this has replaced Gilded Lotus. That was the most obvious replacement. But why is Throne of Eldraine so good? The simple answer is it makes 4 colored mana, and we are rarely going to be impacted by that first clause that's on the card. So when this card enters the battlefield, we can immediately go infinite with Whim of Volrath and only need a single cost reduction to make it infinite with our other two buyback spells. My only concern is that it's legendary, but again, we can simply just legend rule the tapped copy away, keep the untapped token copy that we've made of Throne of Eldraine, and then keep the cycle going. You know, and I think that the restriction of only casting a blue spell with the mana is such a small drawback for this deck because we want to be casting as many buyback spells and as many blue spells as possible anyway, not to mention our commander's also in blue. And remember that this card can be tapped the turn it comes into play. So like I said, it's immediately infinite with Whim of Volrath, even without the cost reduction. And next is a personal favorite of mine, Coveted Jewel. We shouldn't have a problem casting it for 6 because of our likely mana accelerated board state, but stapled onto the card is, yeah, you know, if you copy me, you basically just win the game because every single time we copy one, we draw 3 cards every time you ETB a copy. And you get to tap each copy for 3 blue mana. This card is inevitably always an all-star when I play it, and you should definitely be running it. It adds so much consistency to the deck and sets you up to win almost immediately. And lastly, for artifacts is Commander Sphere and Mind Stone, which can be crucial in this deck because you can sacrifice the copies to draw cards. Now, Commander Sphere is unquestionably better in this circumstance because you get to tap them for mana first and then sack them, but I think they're both notable. Lastly, for combos, I wanted to mention Peregrine Drake, which will easily make us infinite mana the turn it comes down with literally any of our buyback spells. Then on top of this, we can literally make millions of Peregrine Drakes, millions of 2/3 flyers. Just try to accomplish this on your opponent's end step with one of our instant buyback spells. That way you can actually swing out when it gets to your turn. Now, I did want to mention just a few more interactions before we move on and do things with our infinite mana, aka our win cons. And the first is that of Muldrifter. So our little Mully boy, he has an evoke cost, meaning you can cast it for cheaper. You still get the ETB effect, but then he's sacrificed upon entering the battlefield. Now, there is a window when the draw 2 cards ability goes on the stack where you can actually target Muldrifter with one of our instant spells and make a copy of it with Orvar. So this goes, you evoke cast Mully, meaning you have the sack trigger on the stack and the draw 2 on the stack. You hold priority, you cast an instant spell targeting the Drifter. Then finally, Orvar adds his ability to make a copy of the targeted creature. So then it resolves backwards. You make the copy, you ETB and draw 2 cards, and then you get the effect of whatever instant you used on Muldrifter. Then you draw 2 more cards, and then Muldrifter, the original, is finally sacrificed. Now you're left on board with a permanent Muldrifter, which then you can make further copies of. So effectively, you have a great draw engine for the deck for only 4 mana. That's pretty sweet. Next is Shipwreck Dowser, and this card is much, much better than you think. Let's go to the stack. So we're assuming for this purpose, you already have a Shipwreck Dowser on the battlefield. So first we cast a targeting spell, ideally one like Cerulean Wisps, which will draw us a card. Then Orvar will trigger, adding his ability to the stack to make a copy of the Dowser. The Dowser will ETB first, the copy, getting us back an instant from our graveyard, and then the initial spell will resolve, drawing us a card, and then it will go to the graveyard as a part of the resolution. Now, all we have to do is simply rinse and repeat. We cast the instant that we got back from the graveyard to make another Dowser. We get our Cerulean Wisps pulled back out of the graveyard, and then we can target again. So with the Cerulean Wisp. So effectively, if we have infinite mana, we draw our deck. But in actual practice, what this means is we draw into our win con, whatever that may be. Now, this is a soft 4-card combo, but more often than not, the Dowser is just a really good and nice consistency piece to have in the deck, just to make sure we can pull back those important spells, such as our buyback spells. Not to mention that you get to keep the copies of the Dowser on the board anyway, and they have prowess, so you can swing out on your turn and hopefully do lethal damage to the whole board. I've already hit on various ways to make infinite mana in the deck, so now let's talk about some win conditions, some things that we can actually do with that mana. So I'm going to start with some that don't immediately win the game per se, but do put us in a winning spot, and often, in my experience, they just result in a concede from the whole table. So this is cards like Aether Channeler, Agent of Treachery, and the aforementioned Venser Shaper Savant. Now, all these cards return to hand or they steal. The better effects are definitely from the Agent of Treachery or Venser. When I play these out, I mostly don't care about the non-land permanents my opponents control. I would much rather either steal or return my opponent's lands to hand, sending them back to the Stone Age. And what that also does most of the time is bait out any instant speed effects that my opponents may have been holding up. So, this of course is situational. If your opponents have some type of win con on board, or there's some other way that they can disrupt what you're doing clearly on the board, interact with that, steal that, or return it to hand. But, by all means do it, but use your head. I think if you take away their mana, oftentimes it just results in a concede for the table, even if you don't have the full infinite combo. I should also mention that returning your lands to your opponent's hand, even if you don't have a clear objective way to win the game immediately, is not really a bad thing in Orvar, because you get copies of all those creatures that you're targeting to do the effect with. So what you can do on your next turn, as long as your opponents don't have any 1-mana ways to disrupt things, is swing out and kill everybody. It doesn't draw the game out drastically long. Now, I've already mentioned cards like Peregrine Drake, but let's talk about Master of Waves. This card is busted. Why? Because all of our tokens that we're making copies of throughout this game have the appropriate CMC on them. They remember what their CMC is. So our devotion to blue, in this case, will include all of the token copies that we've made up to this point. Just making a few copies of Master of Waves is enough to quickly and efficiently remove our opponents in this go wide strategy. We don't even need infinite mana for this to be that insane. And now for our most interesting, but perhaps most confusing one, Precursor Golem. This card has excited me so much that it became an auto-include for my personal deck list. So this card reads, when Precursor Golem enters the battlefield, create 2 3/3 colorless Golem artifact creature tokens, and whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell that targets only a single Golem, that player copies the spell for each other Golem the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those Golems. I'm gonna let that sink in for a moment. So yeah, this gets insane really fast. Let me explain. Initially, we have 3 golems after the initial spell resolves. So we have the Precursor Golem and the 2 tokens. And then we target our Precursor Golem with, let's just use it again, Cerulean Wisps. So now we have both Orvar and the golems triggered ability on the stack. But because they would trigger upon the same cast, we as the player with priority get to choose how those triggers go on the stack. So we choose to first make the copy of the golem, and then the golem's ability is going to resolve. That's how it's going to happen. So our single Cerulean Wisps will yield us 6 cards drawn for a single blue mana off of 1 instant spell. Insane. Now, if we were to cast it, like let's say again, now we have another Cerulean Wisps magically, and we have our 2 Precursor Golems on the battlefield, we're going to get multiple triggers off the effect. So stick with me. If we continue with the above case, the next targeting spell that we do will be put on the stack, and then we get to order our triggers with both Golems and Orvar now. So let's make our 3 more Golems. So now we have 9. So now the spell that we copy is going to trigger twice because of our Precursor Golem for 9 Golems. So that would be 1 mana, draw 18. It gets exponential after only 2 to 4 casts, so be very, very careful not to deck yourself out. And our final win condition is, of course, extra turn spells. The ones I've included here are Temporal Mastery and also Temporal Trespass, which I've included because they can easily be cost reduced. Often a single extra turn spell is all we're going to need to win with Orvar. Do not underestimate the power of 1 extra turn with Orvar. That really can blow the game out. It feels impossible to talk about every interaction with this deck, but I did save a few notable ones that didn't fit in anywhere else nicely for the very end of this video. So here they are. Let's mention Dizzy Spell, which will allow us to either target or tutor up a card like our Spell Seeker or Solve the Equation to get to those extra turn spells or our Whim of Volrath. Hydroblast is another one of these weird rules interactions cards, so we can target our own permanent even though it isn't red. It's just that the spell will fail to do anything after it has resolved. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our copy effects and also our synergy pieces for the deck. I have 2 ways to specifically copy Orvar, another 4 card draw type of effects stapled onto creatures, and multiple effects to tutor out some of our best spells. You can see how I could just kind of keep going and going, and I'd encourage you to check out the final deck list, which is down in the description of my Architect. Now, there will absolutely be more effects that Wizards release that synergize very well with Orvar. And truthfully, I think that Orvar has a chance to slowly work his way back into the competitive scene as more of these are released, sort of like Throne of Eldraine. My goal with this video is for you to understand and also explore the different interactions and rules that can be confusing at a first glance. And I hope that this video helps you feel more comfortable at the table and more confident that in fact you are doing the right thing. Now, I would not play this deck until you can basically recite everything that I've relayed in this video. People will get confused very quickly, or they simply won't trust you if you can't explain why your deck works the way it works. This also results in people feeling like you're cheating them, for instance, and it's my goal for you to understand so this doesn't happen. Now, it is ultimately your responsibility, no one else's, that you understand your deck. It is your responsibility. Let me be very clear about that. As mentioned, this video took a lot of work. My script alone was over 20 pages long, and it took many hours of playtesting, rules checking, and just overall awkward moments at the table in order to make this video possible. I'd really appreciate if you could subscribe to the channel so I can keep making videos just like this one. As always, you can find this deck list and also my others linked down in the description below on my Architect profile, and you'll also be able to find my TCG Player storefront link down in the description if you want to financially support what I'm doing. Growing the channel means more outreach and more chances to collaborate with other creators, which is a big goal of mine. Support my addiction so I can continue supporting your addiction. I've been Kyle, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.